Let's jump into you have a buyer, you just got under contract, and now what are we doing? So, the most important step once you are executing a contract, and when I say execute a contract, I do want to add a little side note here. If you are the last agent whose client's initialing off on any changes to the initial contract, your people are last to sign essentially. You're in charge of sending that contract to title and to the other agent the day your clients sign off on it and execute it, making that date um, on the contract, the effective date. That's the word I'm trying to think of. Blah. Anyways, so let's say you guys go back and forth, your clients sign off, you need to have them plug in the effective date, your clients, when they initial. That day, you need to deliver notice of the executed contract to the buyer's agent and to title. So you're going to make sure that date is on that page. I never want a contract to go to title without a date on it. That date defines all the other dates going forward, so it's really important it's accurate. Once that date's on there, you send it to all parties. You then have 3 days. The date it's executed is day 0. So then you have 3 more days to deliver the option money and earnest money to title. That will be one payment sent to title. So I would call title and have them start working with your buyer to figure out how to get the money there. If your buyer has a check, they can write a check and deliver it to title. Or most title companies will use a Zoccam, Zoccam, I think, Zoccam app. They can send the check through the app. That's the easiest way. Or they can wire the funds. If your buyer wants to wire funds, you need to have title talk to your buyer directly. You do not send an email or a text, nothing about wires. Well, you can text your client, but do not send any emails about wires. And you do not want to be the one verifying information for wires. But the most important part of all of this is that that money must be at title no later than when they close on that third day. If that third day falls on a weekend or falls on a holiday, then it will push to the next business day. But by the time the title company closes on that next business day, they've got to have that money in their hands, or you haven't failed, your buyer doesn't have an option period. So it's really, really important we make sure that happens. If you find you're on the third day and your client is struggling to get money to title, you need to call Carlin immediately. Let's figure out a game plan. Okay, once we're under contract, our termination option period is going to begin. That's when your buyer needs to do all of their research to make sure they really do want this home. We're going to schedule the inspection as soon as possible. We're going to negotiate and address any issues as soon as possible in that option period. The option period ends at 5 p.m. on that last day. So if we executed with an effective day of today, that's day 0. Let's say we have an option period of 7 days. You're then going to count out the next day as day 1 and count out 7 days. Essentially, you've got a week to negotiate and get something, an amendment signed off in writing by the other side by 5 p.m. The only thing that that contract stipulates is that the buyer has the right to back out by 5 p.m. on that last day. So that doesn't mean the seller has to negotiate anything. They can say, tough, take it or leave it. The agent could fall off the face of the earth and no communication. Your buyer has to decide to take it or leave it. If they're going to terminate, they must do so by 5 p.m. It needs to be hopefully in writing on a termination form. But if you're up against a deadline and it's 4:55 and your client says terminate it, then just send a text and an email to the listing agent immediately so that you have verified notification that you did terminate by 5 p.m. and then follow it up with a termination later. If your buyer does terminate, you'll send the notice of termination along with the release of earnest money so that your client can get the earnest money back. Okay, moving forward after our option period, we're going to do an appraisal. The lender, as soon as you're through your option period, you're going to let the lender know, hey, we made it through, everything's looking good. Please go ahead and order the appraisal. You'll find out when it's due back, and then you'll check on it when it comes back in. He won't probably tell you how well it appraised or the value it appraised, but he should be able to say it made value. He'll tell the buyers. The buyers are obviously privy to that information, and then they may tell you, but some lenders will not tell the buyer's agent. At the same time that the lender's ordering their appraisal, title's ordering their title commitment. We're then gonna, once we get all the approvals, the lender's working with the borrower to get their approval for the borrower. Um, all once everybody's done their job, the title company will then coordinate the closing. You'll need to schedule it for a convenient time for your buyer. You'll want to make sure your buyer gets their final numbers 3 days prior to closing, and then closing will take place. I recommend you schedule the closing at least a week prior to the closing date. If you wait till the last minute, you can, title can be busy and full and run into issues. The other thing to keep in mind, I never want closing dates on Fridays. We want them on Wednesdays or Thursdays to give room for Friday in case anything pushes. Otherwise, you're going to have a really upset buyer who doesn't get keys on a Friday to move in, and they just lost a whole weekend. Also remind your buyer that they do not get keys until both parties sign and lender reviews all docs and all the money is there. And again, that could take all day. It could take 2 days sometimes. So just depends on when people are signing. So just make sure you schedule, put in your contracts a closing date for a Wednesday or a Thursday. The other reason we want to close on Wednesday or Thursday is because, God forbid, wire fraud does happen. There is a small chance the FBI can get involved quickly and get it back. If it happens on a Friday, the money's gone. You have all weekend for that money to get transferred to another account and the money is long gone. So Wednesday or Thursday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday for closings, not on Fridays. Okay, let's dive deeper into this option period. So again, that's our due diligence period. What do we need to uncover? We need to do an inspection. If there's a well, they're going to want to inspect the well. You can also have a permit pulled for the well. That's a public document. Google it and you can find it. Septic permit, same thing. The septic permits are filed with the county, but you can request the county to send you over the details from when that permit was originally filed. That'll give you more details on the septic, but you're going to want to do an inspection on the septic. When you write an offer for a septic, ask the seller to pay for the pumping, and then your buyer should do the inspection. Your buyer should not pay for that pumping, but if you don't ask for it on the contract, you're not going to get it paid for. Sprinklers, pools, those are additional items that you would want to let an inspector know to do. Termite and pest, that's required for a VA loan for sure, but your buyer should want it anyways. Does your buyer need to verify schools and bus routes? Getting a clue report insurance quote for homeowners insurance. We use Paul Guerrero with Allstate. He'll go and pull a clue report at no charge for your clients. This is really important. You're doing this in the option period for every one of your buyers. Also go through and pull a history of the MLS for the home. Just pull old sales, pull old disclosures. There's a lot to find and uncover there. It's really important. I would honestly pull history of the sale of the home before I even wrote the offer. Beyond that, before I wrote the offer, I made sure it's not in floodplain. I checked that floodplain map. And I'm thoroughly reading through that seller's disclosure and I'm asking any questions before we go under contract. If that seller's disclosure talks about insurance claims, I want the receipts. If it talks about roof repairs, I want the receipts. You get the idea. The other thing I would make sure I have before I wrote the offer is the survey in T47. Okay, special notes on negotiations. All negotiations have to be done in writing. There are amendments. If the amendment involves money, so the only way to ask for money in lieu of repairs is, well, there's two ways. By reducing the sales price, but that doesn't really keep money in your client's pocket, or by asking for closing costs paid for by the seller on behalf for your buyer. That's the best way. Paragraph 12A or 1B right here is to ask for money to help reduce your buyer's closing costs. That keeps more money in their pocket from closing, and then they can do the repairs. If you have to, last resort, have the seller do the repairs, but make sure those amendments are very, very specific. Get the wording, ask me or the mentor chat to get the exact wording for those repairs. Otherwise, you're going to end up in trouble. The other note I want to say on this amendment is again, we have that 5 p.m. deadline to terminate. So you need to send the amendment way before 5 o'clock. If you're asking for big ticket items, you better give them, a day's notice, a heads up that, hey, I'm going to be asking you to do the roof or replace the septic or whatever. Don't ever get a seller's back against the wall at 4 o'clock on the day the option ends and expect a good outcome. It's not going to go well. Okay, wording matters. I go into wording here. I'm not going to read it, but you guys should understand. Like if you just say service the AC, that's very, um, it's too generic, not specific enough, and things are not going to get done that need to get done. So just make sure you're referring to this when you need wording, and then ask us, ask the mentors. Okay, once we're under contract, our job again is to deliver a copy of the contract to title, also to the lender if your buyer is using a loan. Make sure title also knows who the lender is. Ensure that the money gets there like we talked about. You're going to coordinate the inspections, get the results, go over them with your buyer. I recommend you show up for the inspection at the end with your buyers and go over it with the inspector, especially if you're new for the first few years. It's a great way to really learn how inspections work, what they're looking for, but it also helps your buyers if they're first time home buyers. It will make them feel better if an inspector is explaining everything to them in person versus they just get the report. If they just get the report, they're going to freak out. My rule of thumb is have them get the report, sleep on it, and then let's talk the next day about our game plan going forward. We usually only get to negotiate bigger items, structural defects, system issues. I mean, obviously they can ask for whatever they want, but most sellers are going to turn it down if you sit there and say, here's 40 items that I want you to address. You know, the rule of thumb is that if the home was built to code 20 years ago, then obviously things are going to be out of code today on the inspection report. But if there's safety issues, those are things we can negotiate. But if they're not safety issues, chances are a seller's not going to want to do that work. Ensure the lenders order the appraisal and check on due dates. Make sure you stay on top of the lender. I like checking on the lender weekly, but I also will check in with the buyer and say, how's it going with the lender weekly? Review all emails from title. This is really important. Title's going to send you 3 items that are really important: the HOA package, the title commitment, and the tax certificate. You have to look at all of those and make sure everybody's on the same page for those. Make sure your buyer understands what those are. In the title commitment, there's going to be links to the deed restrictions. Your buyer needs to see those and understand that they're there. Towards the end, you're gonna have your buyer schedule connection to the utilities about a week before closing for the day of closing. The seller should have already scheduled theirs, and then the buyer will schedule theirs. The seller should have scheduled their termination, and then the buyer will schedule the connection. You want it all to happen on the same day so the utilities don't get shut off. Have them forward their mail. Then ask for a testimonial before closing. If you wait for the testimonial after closing, your buyer is moving and moving on. It's really hard to get that back later on. Coordinate with the listing agent how to get keys once it funds. Again, we don't get to have the money, or we don't get to have the keys until it funds, and buyer and seller both have to sign off. So let's say your buyer signed at 10 a.m. Your buyer is going to think they get keys by 10:30. That's not how it happens. The seller then needs to sign. Well, what if the seller doesn't sign till 4 o'clock that day? The wire cutoffs were 4 o'clock. Now we're not going to have money and funding until the next day. Again, prepare. If your buyer absolutely has to have keys early, let the listing agent know ahead of time. Ask the listing agent to make sure they sign first thing in the morning so that hopefully you have a chance of getting keys earlier in the day. Be sure, number 16 is incredibly important. We always want to do a walkthrough prior to closing. If my buyer's signing at 10, do the walkthrough at 9 or 8:30. Meet your buyers there and walk through it. If your buyers cannot attend the closing, they're out of town, you still need to do a walkthrough. Get your eyes on the home. When sellers move out, things happen to the home. Things go wrong. It's really important. We get our eyes on the home. It is what we expect. They left everything we asked them to leave. You know, it's clean if we asked them to clean it, all that good stuff. Um, if there's an issue when you do the buyer walkthrough, call me immediately, get me involved, or call the mentors, Chad or Trinity. You immediately will then call the listing agent and say, hey, we have a problem and we're not going to close unless this thing is addressed, whatever it is. Ensure the lender and buyer know what's needed for closing. The buyer needs to bring their photo IDs. They've got to prove who they are, and the money's got to be there. Their down payment, their closing costs, whatever, have to be there. You'll schedule a closing. I recommend a closing gift, but that's totally optional. I always did a closing gift, and then I did a binder for them. I would bring a binder to closing that would have in there the survey, the inspection report, the appraisal, any repair receipts, and then I'd have tabs in it so that my buyers can use it going forward to keep all of their paperwork for their home in that binder. And then a few years down the road when they're ready to sell, hopefully they still have that binder and they can hand it over to you and you've got it for the next transaction. Okay, in the portal under buyers, you're going to have this buyer under contract checklist. This is going to help you work through what has to happen when a buyer goes under a contract. One of the things I didn't mention in that timeline above is that as soon as you go under contract, you need to get all the documents to the company so that we can review them and create a DA for you. A DA is a disbursement authorization form that tells title to pay you your check once it funds. Now, on this checklist here, it says .loop. We do not use .loop anymore. It's SkySlope. So make sure you've checked out the SkySlope class or watched the recording on how to use SkySlope and start jumping in and using SkySlope. If you've gotten this far, hopefully you've used SkySlope to write the offer and do all your negotiations with it. Let's see. Okay, this is an example of your HOA document. So this is your resale package that tells you like what the money's involved, and then the resale information. So that's kind of an example of what you'll get from title for that. Okay, next step is listing. So I'm going to jump off this one. Talk to you guys soon.